Are you a poetry lover? And if so, do you prefer a more classical approach to poetry, or are you into more of the modern day type poetry? Hi, my name is K.A. Block, and I am the award winning poet and author of 4 books that consist of poetry and prose. My channel is called The Practical Poet, and that right there might give you a little bit of clue as far as which type of poetry that I prefer. I do prefer a more modern day approach to poetry, kind of something a little bit more uh, casual, less structured, maybe a little bit of storytelling. And that is what I feature on my channel at The Practical Poet. And I also have a blog of the same name. But recently I've been delving a little bit more into the classics and trying to kind of decipher them and see if maybe I couldn't be won over to the classical side of poetry. And I'm still not. I still do prefer the modern day, but I threw it out there a couple weeks ago to see if people had a preference. And I didn't really get any comments, which I kind of didn't expect to. But one person did respond and said that she appreciates both types of poetry, and that's perfectly fine and acceptable. I'm learning to get a little bit more into the classics, but I'm still not there yet. I'm a work in process. But I thought I would throw it out there again. I had a little bit of fun doing the challenge. I did 2 of them so far, not even a challenge, but just a video where I talk about a classical poem and read a couple of verses, and then read a more modern day poem and see if you are drawn to one more than the other. This goes back to a college or maybe even high school English literature class where we had to decipher some of the older poems. And I looked at some of them, Shakespeare, Old English, and I wasn't always sure that I was interpreting the poem correctly or that I understood the meaning of it with some of the older words and stuff. And then the professor handed out a sheet of, it was actually lyrics from a famous song. And right away, I was drawn right to that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I understand this. I know what they're talking about. This woman is cheating on her husband. And it was the lyrics from the song Lion Eyes by the Eagles. And really was just poetry set to music in my mind. It told a story. And I am drawn to a little bit more of a storytelling approach. And that is featured on my channel. My tagline on my channel is storytelling through poetry. And I did a blog post recently on my blog, again, thepracticalpoet.com/blog, where I delved a little bit more into the differences in the classical versus modern versus something new called ultra modern. And, with the classical, like I've already mentioned, a little bit more structured, more formal, bigger words, sometimes Old English, in my opinion, a little bit harder to understand. And then getting into more of a modern day approach, a little bit more casual, may or may not rhyme, and which the same could be said for classical poetry. Some of it rhymes and some of it doesn't. But with more modern day, a little bit more casual, a little bit easier to understand, something that, I can definitely relate to a little bit more. But that doesn't mean that I'm not learning to appreciate the classics as well. And then even with the classics, some of them do tell a bit of a story. So think about like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven that tells a story, or even, Twas the Night Before Christmas, which was first published in 1823. And that definitely tells a story that we're all familiar with now. And that's the kind of poetry that I'm drawn to. I guess whether it's classical or modern day, I do like a little bit of a storytelling approach to it. And I do tend to be drawn to poems that do rhyme. And that's just what I like. You may feel differently. And some of the classics do fall into that, and some of the modern don't. So I guess maybe I'm learning that whether or not it's modern or classical, that there is a certain style, maybe more so that I'm drawn to. And again, that is a bit more of a storytelling and a little bit more of a rhyming approach. So and then let me mention too something new, a newer type of poetry that's recently sprung up, and I've heard it called as insta poetry, and I always referred to it as micro poetry before I heard the term insta poetry. And this is just shorter lines of poetry, maybe even just 4, 5, 6 lines. Most of them don't rhyme. Typically a little bit of a darker topic. I've seen rape and incest and abuse. A lot of times they're accompanied by a pencil sketch. And there's a very famous author out there by the name of Rupi Kaur, who has many very popular books that are like this. And whether or not it's true or not, I'm just guessing. I kind of think that these shorter type poems were born of the Instagram and TikTok era, where people want something quick, and they can kind of read it and decipher it and move on to the next thing. And so maybe some of the longer poetry, some of the stuff that I write, or some of the stuff, the longer classics, just maybe aren't appealing to people. And I hope the pendulum swings back to where there is an appreciation for, the longer, more detailed or storytelling type of poetry. Again, that is more what I'm drawn to. So again, going back to what I had done a couple times on my channel, where I featured a classical poem and then kind of bounced it up against a modern day. And my intent was just to see if people did have a preference. And like I mentioned, nobody really commented, and that's perfectly fine. I hope people enjoyed the videos nonetheless, and maybe got a little bit of a taste of classical, or even modern if they tend to stick to one type of genre. So I'd like to do it again on this video here. I'm actually featuring two different poems, one from the classical era, the 1890s, I believe, and one from more modern day. So I'm going to go ahead and take a quick sip of tea before I get into the poetry reading. And I'm not going to read the whole poem. I'm just going to read a few verses, enough to kind of just have a small discussion about it. I'm not really analyzing the poem, just talking a little bit more about the history and maybe some of the meaning behind it. And then I'll get into the modern day poem. So this poem is from Emily Dickinson, very famous classical female poet. And this is a poem called Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And I'm just going to go ahead and read a couple of verses from this. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. And so that's just a couple of verses from that poem. First of all, let's talk about the title, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Whoa, that is an amazing title. I just love that title so much. So this tends to imply that this was a very busy person. She was just living her life and going about her day and wasn't really thinking about death. And isn't that the way most of us live? Hopefully, we just go about living our lives. And but the theme here, the message is that, when it's your time, death is going to find you. And death happened to find this woman in the form of a carriage ride. Just to go back a little bit before we get too far into it, just like I mentioned, love the title. This poem was originally published in 1890. Posthumously, I think is the way you say that, which means after Miss Emily Dickinson's death. And this was a poem that made its way into a book of her poems called Poems Series 1. It was published in 1890. This work was never authorized to be published by Emily Dickinson, so it's unknown whether or not she abandoned this poem or if she did complete it. But nonetheless, it did make its way into that book of poems that was published after her death. The poem just talks about a busy woman that just happens to be picked up by death. And notice that death is a character in this poem. So death is personified in this poem. And death has been personified in many movies and TV shows. The movie Meet Joe Black, death was played by Brad Pitt. And death was kind of a playful character that was following around. I can't remember who the gentleman was. Was it Anthony Hopkins? I'm not sure. But anyway, death was personified in that movie. In the TV show The Twilight Zone, there's been a couple of episodes where death was a character. And then, if you have kind of a silly side and you watch The Family Guy, there's a character of death on there, which, it's Family Guy. So the character of death is, as silly as Peter Griffin is. But anyway, in this poem, this busy woman, I'm just kind of glancing down at my notes if you see me look down, she takes a personified carriage ride with death. And death is not a scary person or a scary character in this poem. Death is very cordial, and they just take a nice leisurely stroll through the countryside. And so death is a gentleman taking her to, what the poem implies is taking her to her final resting place in a lovely carriage ride. And there's a lot of metaphors in this poem. First of all, the carriage ride. This is kind of a metaphor, taking us from, the journey from life to death, just going on this carriage ride. In between that is immortality. We don't really think about our death, right? We all kind of think we're immortal until, unfortunately, the day that death does come for us. And in this carriage ride, like I mentioned, she is going on this lovely little carriage ride, which insinuates to me that it is a peaceful death. And isn't that what we all want? We all want this nice, peaceful carriage ride, taking in the sights with this lovely character that of death that is leading us to our final resting place. And so that leisurely carriage ride, in a way, depicts the process of dying. The dying process where just sometimes just going along and death is going to find us. It may be a long death, drawn out death, or it may be a little bit quick. I'm not really sure how long this carriage ride lasts. It doesn't really get into that, but he is implied taking her to her final resting place. One thing that I thought was interesting in here, talking about metaphors, was the last verse that I read, where she talks about, we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. But then the next line was, we passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. And I thought that was interesting, because children typically are not at recess at the same time that the sun is setting. So I feel like the setting sun was maybe a metaphor for the sun setting on her life as she was on this carriage ride. So I thought that was interesting. And then the very last verse, which I didn't read, or actually the second verse from the last, says, we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. So that was an interesting verse, because a house that seemed a swelling of the ground, the roof was scarcely visible. That sounds almost like a tombstone, doesn't it? When you think about a tombstone, the house, or where the person is I don't want to say living, and the person is encased, I guess, is underground, and the tombstone is rising up. And so that's what that sounds like to me. So it does sound like maybe she was delivered to her final resting place, and that is her tombstone, and she is now underneath the ground, and the tombstone is rising up. So lots of different metaphors in here. It was written that Emily Dickinson was a very religious person, or she had very strong Christian values. She did believe in the afterlife. But there's a quote that I read that makes me wonder about that. This was from poets.org, and it is a little bit of a longer quote, but it states on here that in a letter to Abaya Root, Dickinson once asked, and here's the quote, does not eternity appear dreadful to you? I often get thinking of it, and it seems so dark to me that I almost wish there was no eternity. So that doesn't sound like somebody really who is a big believer in the afterlife. So I'm not sure what I think on that. So everybody in the write-ups and stuff like that talked about her, that there was no fear of death, that she was had very strong beliefs in the afterlife. But I don't know, that quote gives me some pause. So anyway, you can find this poem online. Again, the name, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which is maybe one of the most awesome titles that I've ever heard for a poem. And you can read the whole thing on poets.org or anywhere that features poetry, or you can find it in the book called Poems Series 1, 1890. So now I'm going to get into a little bit more of a modern day poetry reading. And whereas on the first poem, the character was being led to her death and the afterlife, presumably, in this next poem, the main character, is already in the afterlife. And while his family is grieving, he's actually rather enjoying the afterlife and having a good old time there. So I'm going to go ahead and read you that poem. This is from a poem called Gone from This World. And here's just a couple of verses from that poem. And in that other world, the man watches from afar. He settles in the evening sky and perches on a star. He sees his family live out each night and their evening routine. He catches bedtime stories and all the moments in between. He watches his children graduate and walk across the stage. He shakes his head in disbelief that they are of this age. He sees them through the next month and all throughout the years. His daughter takes on a suitor amid her mother's fears. He's a spectator at the wedding as he hovers near a pew. His daughter comes down the aisle, and something borrowed, something blue. So that was a few excerpts from the poem Gone from This World. This is actually one of my pieces of work. This is in my latest book called Sow Seeds of Wisdom. And this was published in 2024. Again, the poem Gone from This World. And this, again, the main character in this poem, he had a tragic trip to work that one morning, and he ended up being killed on his way to work. And the first half of the poem talks about how he ended up dying, and his family is just grieving. They are just devastated over his death. But like I mentioned, he finds a way to make the best of his situation, and he's actually having a rather good time in the afterlife. And he's watching his family, and even though they miss him terribly, he feels like he's not missing a thing. He is seeing everything that's going on. And the poem culminates with a bit of a spiritual encounter that he and his daughter have at her wedding. She senses that he's there, and they kind of look over. She kind of looks over in the direction where he's hovering at that pew, and they share a bit of a moment there. And so it was a nice kind of way to portray, to think about the afterlife, that we still are around our loved ones, even though they may miss us terribly, or we may miss people who have passed on terribly. I still feel like they're around. So the other central theme in this poem is not only the afterlife, but also that those of us that are living, life goes on. I mean, the family was grieving dearly for this man, but they had to keep living, and the children had to grow up, and they had to finish school and graduate, and then the daughter, gets a romantic partner, and eventually she ends up getting married. And even after this spiritual encounter that she has with her father, her life goes on, and she has to continue on with her wedding. So just that message that life does go on. So anyway, you can find that poem on my blog at thepracticalpoet.com/blog. Poem is called Gone from This World, also featured in my latest and fourth book called Sow Seeds of Wisdom. And see if you're drawn to one type of poetry rather than the other. If you like the second verse and you want to hear more modern day poetry, I hope that you visit my channel at The Practical Poet, where each week I do a weekly video poetry reading. You can like and subscribe, and you'll be notified when I put out my latest video poetry reading. Or if you don't want to listen to the video poetry reading, again, you can find all of the written poems that I feature on my blog at thepracticalpoet.com. So drop me a comment. Let me know if what you think about either of those poems. I'd love to hear, see if you're drawn to one more than the other. And I thank you so much for sticking with me for this modern day versus classical poetry challenge. And I hope you have a great day, and go read some poetry. So talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.